This clock was built in 1836 by a German immigrant, Isaac Goetz, and it's been ticking and chiming ever since. For the past 30 years, it's ticked and chimed only 400 feet from the site where John and Kathryn Close became the first Lake Bluff settlers in that same year, 1836. Like Isaac Goetz, John and Kathryn were German immigrants who found their way to Chicago. On their arrival, they walked the 35 miles north along the lake shore until they reached that small spot of the world which would become Lake Bluff. They turned from the shoreline sands into the base opening of a ravine, later to be called Liliendel's Drive, walked up the north lateral to the top of the bluff, 70 feet above lake level, looked about them at the beauty of the woods, the ravines, and the lake, and settled. This is not a history. Lake Bluff's history was ably presented by the village historian Elmer Vliet in his book published in 1985. Rather, this is a verbal collage of memories and impressions by longtime residents of our community. Perhaps it will provide a glimpse of that sense of specialness we all feel about Lake Bluff.
My name is Gus Trobec, and my wife is Valerie. We came to Lake Bluff in 1938.
I'm Janet Ullman, 87 years old, have lived since 1935 in Lake Bluff with my husband, Stuart Ullman. When he died, I moved to a smaller house on the same street, Witchwood Lane, and sold the big house.
My name's Floyd Weshinskey. I'm a resident of Lake Bluff, have been for, initially came here 50 years ago. And I spent a great deal of that time connected with the Lake Bluff District 65 School District.
In 1945, my mom and dad, Polly and Bonnie McQueen, moved to Lake Bluff to buy their very first house. I'm Janet McQueen, Hauser. I have a younger sister, Emily McQueen Geckler. She started kindergarten that fall. I started 4th grade.
For Johnny come lately, why, I can say that I am not I'm not one of the oldest members of the community. I found that out one time when there was a farewell party for Leo Grost, and they called on people who had been here for 5 years, and a lot of hands went up, and a lot of 10 and 15 and 20. And I thought, now this is going to be, we're going to be one of the older people. 25, my goodness. I don't know whether it was 30 at that time, but from there on I took a back seat because there were people who were there for 40, 45, 50, 60, 70, and I think there was some 80-year-old people who had been here at the time. I had been in practice of medicine outside of Boston in Medford, Massachusetts for 9 years, and then in the Navy I was moved out here. So that my arrival in Lake Bluff was as a naval lieutenant commander.
Vern Wesselhoeft, and I'm Charlie Wesselhoeft. Okay. And my roots in Lake Bluff go back quite a ways. I was born here on May 22, 1917. And my grandfather bought the 2 lots, in the early 20th century.
I moved to Lake Bluff in 1953, and I lived there on Sylvan Road, 341 Sylvan Road.
I'm Edna Revenaugh, 91 years old, is that what you said? And came to Lake Bluff. I don't remember the year, but many years ago, and have lived here ever since.
I'm Bill Van Vlissingen, and I've been a Lake Bluff resident all of my life. Family came here when I was 1 in 1922. And over the course of the years from then, I've lived in 5 different houses in Lake Bluff. Been active in a variety of things, including the village and the county and the township.
I'm Carolyn Goetz, and I moved to Lake Bluff happily 37 years ago with my husband Tom.
While there have been changes in Lake Bluff through the approximately 40 years that we've lived here, it still is the only place where we would want to live.
I'm Bill Levinson. Dorothy, my wife, and I came to Lake Bluff first, if my memory is correct, which it probably isn't, in 1956.
I've had an unabashed love affair with Lake Bluff since June of 1948. At the time that my wife Carrie and I moved into Lake Bluff. And that feeling has just increased ever since.
I'm Kathryn Kuhlman. I'm the wife of Alan B. Kuhlman, and I'm 86 years old, crowding 90.
Well, we moved to Lake Bluff in 1968. In fact, it's rather a humorous story right now. There was always a home on Sheridan Road in Lake Bluff that always reminded me of a house in La Jolla where we lived when Joe was called into service for the Korean War. I called Joe at the office. They drew up a contract, and Joe signed the contract for that house on the car trunk at the Northwestern Station in Lake Forest without ever having seen that house.
My name is Jim Velde. My wife and I came here to Lake Bluff over 45 years ago, to be exact, in 1945. We, that is my wife Esther and I, our one child, a daughter then 9 years old, had lived in an apartment building in Chicago. They are the only 2 places we've lived since we were married in 1934. I had lived for 5 years before that in the Chicago slums in a well-known settlement house named Hull House, which was founded in 1889 by the well-known social reformer Jane Addams.
Henry and I were married in 1927 in Chicago, in Beverly Hills, at my home, and we came to Lake Bluff to live that same summer, just as bride and groom, you know. And of course, Lake Bluff was a very different place at that time. There were a lot of cottages here left from the Methodist campground days, and they were pretty much as they had been right along, too. Kind of funny-looking little things, you know, although rather picturesque.
My name is Genie Shields, and I grew up in Lake Bluff. I came here when I was 3 years old. I remember it actually quite well, and lived here until, really straight through until I went away to college.
I am Barbara Parmalee Stuessy, born and raised in Waukegan, Illinois. I had been a teacher in several cities, and later on at Lake Forest College, I became director of personnel for certain departments and also the executive director of all the insurances.
My name is Charlie Geraghty. I was born in Lake Bluff and have lived there all my life except for 3 years in the service during World War II and 3 years spent in Pittsburgh. Other than that, my home has been in this village.
I'm Robert C. Davis, 608 Mountain in Lake Bluff, Illinois. Zip 60044. And I first came to this village in 1953 when I came with my father to look at the Philip Armour estate as a possible location for our business.
I moved here in 1955 as a comparatively new bride. We had been married for about 3-4 years. And we had 2 children, 3 and 2, and another one on the way.
And then I moved here with my wife Nancy and 2 children at the time.
We moved into the apartment while we were building our first house in town. And Mr. Harlan built that house. And he said he put the heating ducts into the concrete floor to keep them toasty. I often wondered how you got to them if something happened, but nothing did, so it was all right.
Hello there, my name is Ed Muto.
And my name is Betty Muto, and in 1951 I married Ed Muto and moved to Lake Bluff. And when we first moved here, we lived with his mother at 718 Sheridan Road.
My mother and dad immigrated from Italy, and they settled here in Lake Bluff in about 1902. They had 9 children, and I was the last to be born to the family. And Mom's always stated that she can remember when she first came here, Sheridan Road was nothing but a dirt road.
I'm Lawton Crosby, and I came here as a young man of 2, that's TWO, and I'm now 80. So I'm speaking about Lake Bluff from a perspective of 78 years. And it's been 3/4 of a century of wonderful living in this great, really unique little town. The town has grown slowly enough so that the town and the nature of the town has changed the people rather than a sudden influx of people changing the nature of the town.
Basically, and I'll say this till the day I die, Lake Bluff is one of the best towns in the world. Because not only because of the town, but the people in it.
It's the same thing that Ed thinks, the people. We really enjoy the people. And the schools are good. And it's a pretty town.
I don't know. I think that Lake Bluff, as you are more exposed to it and all, it becomes so apparent that it's really one of the few communities in the entire country where it doesn't make any difference how much money you have or how little you have. It's a very wonderful place to live.
He was driving the car, and the kids were in the back, and I was sitting in front, and we came along 176 to go home, and we just came to this street up here. And there was a red light. As we approached it, we saw it was red light. And just as we came up there, it turned to green. "Oh, Daddy," they said in the back, "are you lucky?" He said, "That's not luck. I know the mayor of this town." He was mayor.
My feelings about how special Lake Bluff is because of the people that are here. They are super compassionate, wonderful, whatever. No matter where they live, it doesn't matter. On the other side of the tracks or this side of the tracks or whatever, they're all just super people.
Garth Dunn, who died here a few years ago, once described Lake Bluff as the place where if you wanted to be left alone, you were left alone. If you wanted to run around, why, you could run around.
That's
He
right.
said, whatever you want to do, you can do in Lake Bluff, as long as it's legal.
Yeah.
And I think that was probably the thing that attracts me to the town. I'm not a gadabout, seldom go out, and I like it that way.
The reasons for coming to Lake Bluff were its intrinsic beauty, the ravines going down to that wonderful beach, which was much, much wider than it is now, and the safety. The children could ride or walk anywhere and explore any vacant lot and put up their tents in any vacant lot, play rabbits in any vacant lot, dig holes. They could do almost anything freely and without my worrying about them.
It's not easy to say one thing that makes it what it is. I'm sure that its plain physical attributes are very important. At least to me, I think it is just physically attractive. Not probably beautiful is maybe pretty strong, but there's a sense about the trees, the ravines, the layout of the streets, which is not perfect grid-like and all that. That's important, but the people are certainly more important. And my association is with my contemporaries, particularly, and of a major piece of our lives and a very important period in our lives. That period, well, it was not the first house, it was the second house we ever owned, and I'm sure for many people of our contemporaries it was that, the first or second house. Young children, and then bringing them up, really going through that whole process of having a family, the family growing up, finally leaving. Same time your career is developing as it develops, and to be able to do all that in conjunction with other people who are doing the same thing and were attractive in the sense of basically, well, it's, I'll say they're all intelligent, they're well educated. Certainly an exaggeration, but I thought that all these people are intelligent. They're stimulating to talk to. That it's fun to exchange ideas with them. The sense of informality, of independence that seemed to go with the community made it very attractive. I did work for one of my early clients was the Pillsbury Company, and I went up there to Minneapolis, and I got fairly well acquainted with a number of people who are very similar, who worked there, very similar in age and state of life. And I observed that most of their social life was with people they worked with. It's a smaller community, and so that it was easy enough to socialize with the people you spent your days working with. And I was sorry for them. I thought to come here and socialize and exchange ideas and so on with people who had no connection with my business was vastly more stimulating. It didn't deprive me of getting a lot out of the people I worked with, but I see it as something added right on top, which was a big advantage. But Lake Bluff, the fact that it's small, it's not pretentious. Not you could be rich or poor and nobody knew, possibly, or cared. And I think of it as yes, of free spirits, independent. Some people, I'll go back to the Royers. I mentioned Joe Royer, who had the sailboat. Typical in a way, maybe very typical of people who came to Lake Bluff. He grew up in Oak Park, and just as I grew up in Hinsdale and wanted to just get out a little bit, he and his wife both grew up in Oak Park, and wow, they made this daring move to way out there to Lake Bluff because, damn it, they wanted to be on their own. And I think they're, that might be representative of people who came to Lake Bluff at that stage. They were anxious to go there. Well, I think the Goetz, they grew up in Winnetka, and they came to Lake Bluff. So there was a sense of independence, be your own person, that seemed to go through the whole group.
For some of us old timers, Lake Bluff is Lake Bluff because of nostalgia. But it also smells good in Lake Bluff. It sounds good in Lake Bluff, and I'm sure it smells good and it sounds good other places. My daughter went to college in Chicago, the University of Chicago, and she would come home from Hyde Park on a variety of buses and L's and then the Northwestern. And the dog and I would go up to the Northwestern station and meet her, and Lisa would get off the train, and by the time we'd walked the first block and a half or so, she would say every time, "Mom, it smells so good in Lake Bluff."
In the snows, and there were sometimes quite heavy snows, you'd hear a sound, a lovely sound, a soft, not a shrill, a soft, muted by the snow and the falling snow, muted by the trees, a bell. And then you'd hear clump, clump, clump. And you'd look out and you'd see in the little gaslight glow, you'd see the horse coming, swinging his bell. Dong, dong, ding, dong, slowly pulling his one man, one horse snowplow. It was very nice.
In those days, you could walk from North Avenue all the way to Great Lakes with a very wide expanse of beautiful sand. And we used to swim up there that would be off the Crabtree Farm. And back in those days, you'd have a half a dozen of us, and people didn't go that way, so they didn't know if we took our suits off and swam in the bear. Nobody knew and nobody cared, really. But it was great fun. And just north of North Avenue, maybe a quarter of a mile, there was a very large rock, which just the tip would show in the water, and we used to call that the North Rock.
Oh, yeah, when I was a young lad, we used to go down Center Avenue or right off of Crabtree Farm. But in those days, you could walk probably, I'd say, maybe a block and a half out into the water, and you'd only have water up to your waist in those days. And it was all sand out there. You had a great time. And there was one place right off of Crabtree Farm. You had to be careful because that was private property. And Mr. Duran didn't like people on his property. And out there, I'd say maybe a block or so, there was a huge rock. It was probably maybe covered by water only a foot deep. And we'd go out there, swim out there, and we'd dive off of that and have a great time. And I can also remember that there were large vines on the trees on the beach part, and we used to swing there and try to swing into the water. Of course, the beach was further away at that time. We never really made it to the water, but we had fun swinging anyway.
In those days, we all used to go swimming baretail. A bunch of boys, grammar school, feel like swimming, peel off your clothes and jump in. If you're thirsty, Gil, cup your hands and drink right out of the lake. Perfectly safe, no problem whatsoever. At North Rock, which is a gigantic glacial boulder, I would say fully the size of this room we're sitting in. That was my first pier. That's where we all used to congregate for swimming.
It reminded me that right around here was North Rock, great big rock. We used to come down there swimming. because we could take off our suits.
So we came here in the very first summer we spent on the beach. We lived on the beach. I would go down pushing the little ones down the old dirt road, two on a stroller and the other one tagging along. And then 7 years later, a little boy came along. We had beach picnics at night. We had breakfast on the beach. We'd take naps on the beach. And I still love this lovely lake. It really is a great resource and a source of happiness for us.
As our daughter was growing up and all, the beach was just a real important part of our recreation and also of our neighbors. And it was always, for instance, on a Saturday morning, it was time for me. I'd have to cut the yard, and then I'd do the work on my gardening and have lunch, and then the family, we'd all take off to the beach. And we'd spend the entire afternoon. And our daughter would meet all of her friends down there, both that she was neighbors with, as well as those that she was in school with. And then the same thing was on Sunday after church. Everybody would head for the beach and stay there the entire afternoon. And it was just a wonderful way to spend your time and to enjoy the company of your friends and neighbors. And sometimes, even if the water was a little too cold to get into, why, you could still just enjoy being on the beach itself. And this was generally true, I would say, of the whole village. And then during the week, most of the mothers would try and hurry up with their housework and get everything done by around 10 o'clock, and then maybe pack a lunch and go to the beach with their youngsters and spend a good deal of the day there until it was time to come home in mid-afternoon. And the beach was well maintained. It was sometimes a little rocky on the entrance, but it still was just a wonderful place to be able to go and enjoy yourself. And I think that, well, I don't know. I've never heard of any other community where practically everyone in that community was so involved with the beach. And it's like one woman was heard to say one time on the beach during the week, she says, "Here my husband goes down to a nice air-conditioned office, and I have to sit on this hot old beach." And so we got quite a kick out of that.
Having come from California to Illinois, I'd only seen oceans. I couldn't believe this lake wasn't an ocean. It was so enormous. I couldn't believe it was fresh water. I had to taste it to be sure. I remember seeing it in all its seasons. It was so beautiful. In the fall, and in the spring, and then in the middle of the winter when it was so rugged.
The beach was very important to my wife and the children. In the summer, we moved here in August, so there were some months of summer left. In the summer, the women with small children, that's what they did. They went to the beach. And that entertained the children. And that was also a way that the women got acquainted with each other. So we made probably a large majority of the friends we made were made that way. The beach was full of rocks. Water was bitter cold. I rarely found myself swimming in it, but the kids didn't mind any of that. And they swam and paddled in the water, and we sat on the rocky sand and socialized and had a wonderful time. That was a very important part of our social life.
One of the events I remember I looked forward to each year back at that time was the fire department. Every April, at the time the smelt were running, would have a smelt fry on the beach for everybody in the community. And it wasn't too many years after that, it got too big. But that was marvelous, going down, helping catch the smelt and cleaning them. You didn't really clean smelt very much. You just threw them in the deep fry. But what I remember was putting all the coleslaw ingredients together in the fire department building. And the meal was smelt and coleslaw, as I remember. Maybe there was a soft drink.
Well, Gil Curran mentioned this smelt fry we used to have, and I've forgotten about that. We call it a smelt soiree, and our fire department did this completely on our own. That was back in the days when smelt ran very, very good. We'd fish off the piers down Lake Forest with our dip nets, and a couple of people would even go out and seine fish. And we'd catch them, we'd clean them on the beach until maybe 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. We put them in plastic bags, take them out to a tavern in Roundout, where we knew the person real well. He'd put them in the freezer for us. And after about 3 weeks of this, we'd have the smelt soiree, where we'd set up charcoal burners, and we'd deep fry the smelt. We'd supply the potato chips, the smelt, and people in the community could bring their own beer or pop, whatever, and we'd have 400 or 500 people down at the beach eating this smelt, and they really enjoyed it. This went on for maybe 7 or 8 years. Then, like everything else, the smelt started to disappear. You couldn't catch as many as you wanted to, and we didn't want to go out and buy it. That cost us too much money. We couldn't afford that, being in the fire department. But everyone seemed to have a very enjoyable time.
And our fire department was another group that were unsung heroes at the time, I thought. We had a marvelous record with our fire department. We have to this day. And of course, it's with great pride that I see the village attaining a fire insurance rating of 3 with a volunteer fire department.
I first got out of the fire department back in maybe 51. We had 2 engines, and we had maybe a tenth of the amount of equipment they have today as far as support gear. Now they've got 5 engines, I believe, and at that time Tommy Everett was the chief of the fire department. And he got to be a good politician. He was able to script and scrape so much that at least we had support and we had enough equipment to attempt to fight a fire. And we did a very good job. I was on for 27 years, I believe it was.
I answered a call one night by getting up out of my bed and throwing my clothes on over my pajamas. And it was a grass fire out along the northwestern freight line. And we thought we'd be able to get to it by going up Skokie Highway. We realized that we had to go, we got up by the Goodyear plant, north of Lake Bluff, and realized we had to go back and go up the freight line to take care of this fire. I was appointed the man to get out in the middle of Skokie Highway, which is 4 lanes with no median at that time, and stop the traffic so we could turn this fire truck around and go back in the other direction. When I finished that night, I looked down and I realized my pajamas were coming out of my fly. So in front of those headlights, I had turned around, I had stopped all that traffic for the fire truck.
I was on the library board quite a number of years ago to begin with, and then when Henry retired, somebody suggested he should be on the library board. Of course, I was off by that time. And at that time, we were over there in where the laundromat has been, at that time. And then Mr. Bunch said that he would like to give his building, that little house, that he had his drugstore in, to the library. He was always very interested in the library. And he would like to do that when he died. And he put this will. Well, he finally decided he'd like to have the library there while he was living. And so he lived upstairs, and we moved the books over to that library. Then I don't know how many years we were there, probably 15, 20 or so. Then we started work on the new library. Of course, it took a lot of doing, to get money together for it and to get people in the right mood for it. And Henry was on the library board then. I was off, of course. And the village helped us out a bit because they said that if we could raise, at least $10,000 or more from the village, they had a fund that they could put into the library. And so that set us off, and we got the money raised, and they put their money in that they had in sort of an escrow there, and we went ahead to the library. And Henry, of course, worked on architects, and we had a lot of architect meetings at our house, I know. I used to get out of the room so I could keep my mouth shut. I wasn't on the board. And he put my thing in there. And anyway, they picked the architect and went ahead with it. There were many problems. And then people had lots of different ideas about how the library should look, as you can imagine. Some wanted to have a New England look. Others wanted it to look just like the bank. And, there were lots of ideas on that. But Henry was a very tactful, careful person, so he patiently worked it all around, and we got what we have here now, which is a more modern building, Mm-hmm.
Well, I was in with the Park District. I was on the Park Board twice. The first time was back in the late, well, not really the late, but the middle 50s. And at that time, we were, there were 5 members, and we had a budget, and it's almost inconceivable to think at that time it was around $18,000 a year. And we had 1 employee, and we did pay a part-time treasurer and a part-time secretary. But the activities of the Park District at that time were to, of course, maintain the beach during the summer, provide lifeguards, and of course we paid for the lifeguards by issuing tokens, which the people would pay maybe $5 for the season. Then we had the one superintendent who was a gentleman named Tom Everett, and Tom did just about everything. He kept, and of course we didn't own any equipment. The equipment was all his. And he would rent it to the Park District. And then he kept up the tennis courts, which at that time were clay. And of course, the only tennis courts we had in town were those at Artesian Park. And that was Tom's responsibility. And he did a wonderful job on maintaining those tennis courts. But it later got too much, and so they had to be have surface coatings on them. But the about all the money we had would just go for paying Tom's salary, really, and other odds and ends, and the expenses of gasoline and oil and so forth. Then I went back on the park board in the early 60s, and I became president, and that was the time when we were able to vote the bond issue that acquired the land where the golf course and the swimming pool now are. Now this all started with a citizens group on the west side that was headed up by a gentleman named Wally Ron. And the citizens in that group were very concerned about that property being developed, which would have, which wasn't zoned too well. The lots were small, and it really would not have made a very good project for the village, or be in the interest of the village.
And we were able to hold off development where the golf course is now long enough so that the park district got their act in gear and got us the golf course. And so that was a big help, because those were 40 and 50 and 60-foot lots out there. And that was always a scary thing. What are we going to get here in Lake Bluff?
So in late '61, we passed the ordinance for the bond issue, $250,000. Because in the meantime, our attorney, who was a gentleman named Philip Yeager, who later became a judge in the Lake County District, he had obtained information on the assessed valuation of all the property. So we were able to determine what we would have to pay for the land and could set the bond issue at the right figure. Then we next were faced with the possibility of getting the public sold and wanting to pass the bond issue. And so a citizens committee was formed that was headed up by Nat Acker, and they did a fine job of promoting the project. And what was especially interesting about that bond issue was that people voted for it for so many different reasons. A number of people wanted a golf course. A number of people just wanted open space. And another group of people were afraid that if it was developed, it would place an additional burden on the schools and cause increased taxes and problems of that nature. So the bond issue carried in 1962 by a 4-to-1 margin, which was unheard of in those days for any bond issue to acquire land.
Certainly I remember Dr. Ward making house calls. He made them. Oh, Dr. Ward sent me away from home when he made house calls. My sister got rheumatic fever, or scarlet fever, and Dr. Ward packed us all off. My dad had to move to the Shellebuggers, and I had to move in with Janet Scott and Dorothy Glover across the street. Only my mother could stay in the house with scarlet fever. Dr. Ward did not put up a big quarantine sign in our front yard, but we were quarantined. Certainly he made house calls. I had ear infections a lot as a child. So I remember Dr. Ward in the house in the winter. And Dr. Ward was still making house calls when my dad was sick in 1979 and 1980. And to this day, he doesn't look a bit different than he did then. My sister and Jim's sister were in school with Alice Ward. And they talk of pillow fights with Dr. John Ward. I personally cannot imagine Dr. John Ward in a pillow fight. Much too sedate. However, I can tell you I've seen him walking to the beach with his canoe on his head because he could get out into the lake in his canoe, claiming that that was the only place the phone couldn't get him. So in his shorts, he would walk from his house down and then haul the canoe all the way down the ramp, the road, the old road, on his head, put it in the water and take off, and he'd be out in the middle of the lake. Well, not the middle, I suppose, but out in the middle of the lake for a couple of hours.
We met John Ward, and he came for all our sick. He went to people's homes and still does. The only living doctor that makes home visits, I believe. He had the children a little bit terrified because he looked tall and New Englandish, and he was, didn't smile much. And he told them what they had to do, and they did it. And he treated me exactly the same way, and he still does. But we discovered when we joined Great Books, he was a member, and we were in Great Books for the University of Chicago idea, Great Books. We were together for 30 years in Lake Bluff, and we got to know John Ward totally different. He had a delightful sense of humor, and he very apt comments, often drawn from his experience with people. Never mentioning names, of course. And I remember once when we were discussing a book which was about all the little unloved waifs that are in homes, and we were talking about the orphanage, really. And he said, well, in his experience, a child does not have to have a father or a mother as long as it's someone in the household that loves him very much and that he loves. And it could be a maid, or it could be a nanny of some kind. And he was a very wise person. But he still, to this minute, treats me like a little child.
During my work in Lake Bluff, I have made house calls all these years. That was the standard back in before the war, and even right after the war. Dr. Proxmire and Dr. Bergert and I were all making house calls. This was I got to the place where I used to go up and down the streets and I say, yes, I've been in that house and that house. I'd probably been in half the houses in town. And once in a while I'd come up with some particularly valid observation about health. I remember one woman who had a number of respiratory infections, or had occasional respiratory infections, and one year she suddenly had many more. And I said, what's happened? And I said, now wait a minute. Your bed used to be there in the center of the room, didn't it, or against an inside wall? What made you move it to the outside wall? I'll bet you that the cold air coming off that wall going across you has changed your susceptibility to infections. And sure enough, she moved it. And from then on, I've always told patients, keep your bed 18 inches or more away from an outside wall. And I'm sure that I've done a service to many people that's beyond that of giving them pills from a bottle. Of course, I'm an anachronism. I always feel if a patient is sick enough so that I'm likely to tell them to stay in bed after I leave, then they ought not to come to the office in the first place. They could probably spread germs to other people, or it certainly is not in their best interest. And so I try as far as possible to adhere to the principle that if a person is sick enough, fever or something like that, to need to stay in bed after I've seen them, as judged by the phone conversation, then I ought to treat the patient, not the doctor.
Dr. Sleater, my dentist, always played classical music in his office. You always heard music, and it was always classical music. Seldom opera, concertos, and symphonic. And if you were 7 or 87, that music was playing. And I have a feeling that a lot of people heard classical music that never heard it before and haven't heard it since. Then you sat in his dental chair and got tipped backwards, and dead ahead of you on the wall was an art print by a famous classical artist. And he changed the artwork in his office about once a month. So if you were having a lot of work done, you didn't have to look at the Mona Lisa for the whole time, because somebody, a Monet or a Manet, would be up the next time you went. And Vic Sleater did his best to get culture into some of us.
Howie Wilms and I, you'll probably get interviewed on him. He's owned the pharmacy there for years, but he's now expired. He and I decided to paint the hardware store window black with black screen paint. We were really going to do it big, you know. Well, we did it, and we got caught, and we paid the price. Rodney Glover was the Justice of the Peace that time, and Eugene Spade was the chief. Well, Spade found out who it was, put us in jail for about a half hour, let us sweat a little bit, and about 4 days later, we had to go to court in the village hall, and Judge Glover was there. He was Justice of the Peace. And so he asked Howie and I, why we did it. So we said, well, it was Halloween, the Halloween prank, and he reprimanded us. And in the interim, my mother was very upset. I had 9 children. You're the worst of the lot. I don't know whatever happened to you. And Howie's dad was giving him down the road to beat heck. So anyway, so I get back to the court. Judge Glover says, well, okay, don't ever do it again. He was going to reprimand us. Well, unknown to us, the building was owned by Griffith at that time. And he had just painted the building. It's a brick building, but all the wood trim. And so when Judge Glover said he was going to just give us a reprimand and let us go, Chief Spade came over and whispered something in his ear, and I says, oh boy, we're going to get it now, But he says, well, on the second thought, we're going to fine you $6 apiece. Well, behind all this was that the case was closed if we were fined. If we weren't, maybe Griffith might have taken us to court or to a lower court and make us pay for the paint job. So I do owe that to Chief Spade. But came time to pay the $6 fine. Howie said to his dad, who was deaf at the time, he says, Dad, I need $6. Dad all went like this. He says, what'd you say, Howie? He says, I need $6. And if I can say this on this video, like hell I'm going to give you $6. You did it. You can stay in jail. So I says, Ma, I'm going to need $6. She says, I've always told you kids, you made your bed, you lay in it. So here we know, no $6 a piece. I figured jail's coming again. But Brother Tony was there, and he lent me and Howie the $6 a piece. We paid our fine. And from that day on, we never did anything bad again.
And in 1964, I started working at the Lake Bluff Pharmacy that was owned by Howie Wilms. And I got the job by Ed and Howie were good friends. And one day Ed come home and said, Howie wants to talk to you. And I said, well, what in the world about? He said, well, go up to the drugstore and talk to him. And I said, okay. And I walked in and Howie said, we need you to work here, and I'd like you to start tomorrow. So I did. And I've been working there for 28 years now. And Howie really cared about all the people. If there was ever anyone that had a bill and they come in and they'd say to him, gee, Howie, we're having a little problem. I don't think we're going to be able to pay our bill this month. Why, Howie would say, there's no problem. Whenever you come do it, just thank you for telling me, and that was all that it took. Another thing about the pharmacy that I'm really enjoying now is, like, there are so many people that when they were children, they come in the drugstore and I'd sell them candy and stuff, and now I'm selling candy to their children.
We wanted a really good present for my mother, and the 4 of us decided that a donkey was a burro, actually, a Mexican burro, would be just perfect. And she was the kind of mother that you could think that of. And she would, we had fair reason to believe she would be delighted when he arrived. And we found a burro and bought him. But before we did that, my father told us that we had to go to the city hall in Lake Bluff and see if it was acceptable to have a burro. And I was maybe 7 years old at the time, or 8 years old. None of us were very old then. And we had to do this alone. It was clear from the way it was presented to us that this was to be our project. And so we went up to City Hall, the same building that's there now, and we had to look at the village ordinance. We couldn't even say the word then, but we found this ordinance and we had to read it and see what animals were accepted and what weren't. And your memory is largely correct in that cats and dogs pretty much were the accepted animals. But what the ordinance made the mistake of doing was listing the animals that you could not have in your house. And the animals that they listed were chickens, cows, horses, donkeys, mules, asses. There was a long list of animals that were forbidden in Lake Bluff. Unfortunately for them, they had neglected to name burro on their list. And so we came home elated to my father saying, we can do it, we can do it. Burros are acceptable. And so we went and we bought this burro. I don't know if we talked to our next door neighbor first, although it would have been a good idea, but he never quite got over it. That was Jack McKenzie, founder of Baker McKenzie law firm. He was patient over the years. But anyway, we had that donkey come home. He was unloaded on Mother's Day onto our driveway. And he was named by us in honor of our mother's unique role in Lake Bluff as one of, I think at the time we used to say maybe 5 Democrats, although that may be generous. He was named Adlai, the Democratic donkey, although for the purposes of the city, he was a burro. And he came and lived with us in an old chicken coop out behind our garage. And he was immediately famous because, well, there were only dogs and cats in Lake Bluff. And all of a sudden, here was this burro. And I had wanted a darling, cute little one. And my older brother, who had really wanted a wolf, settled for a burro only if it could be large. And so we got the largest, toughest burro rather than the cutest, furriest little burro, which meant there was a hidden benefit in that. It meant that as we grew with Adlai in our house, he was big enough and strong enough that all 4 of us could ride on his back at once. And we did that sometimes. We'd ride around with all 4 of us lined up on his back. We were instant celebrities isn't the right word. We were, well, everyone wanted to be our friend. All the kids, I should say, would come over to our house and line up to ride him. And we'd give rides around our yard, and we'd give exciting rides down the ravine. Our house was on the ravine, and we'd go down the narrow little paths of the ravine. And we had him for 4 years. We rode him in the parades for the 4th of July. The 4th of July parades were and are great in Lake Bluff, but in those old days, they were truly sort of homemade events. And children used to dress up their pets, and we'd put roses around Adlai's ears and put crepe paper into his tail. We did it ourselves. It was very homemade, but very nice. And we'd ride him in the parade, and I still remember the first year we had him, when the real Adlai was running for the presidency. I was riding him that particular year, and I was stoned in this nice, gentle village of Lake Bluff. There were kids who knew what he represented and threw stones at me, which I guess gives you some insight into the fact that Lake Bluff then was a definitely Republican town. and old Adlai, it caused a real conflict in particularly in the hearts of children who were following their parents' model to be good Republicans, but really wanted to come over and ride that burro, knowing that his name was Adlai the Democratic donkey. My mother loved it. She loved having him.